Some love running. Some hate it. Some are just starting. Some have been running since they took their first steps. Some think running is the most natural form of movement there is. Some think it's demanding, hard, and takes everything they have. Some run fast. Some run far. Some run for fun. Some run because it's an obsession. Some run because they want to get fitter, lose weight, or feel energized. Some run because they want to beat their opponents, their personal best, or win a race. Everyone is different, but everyone is a runner. The question is, which kind of runner are you? Find out April 2022.
Run. Run more. Run faster. Run stronger. Run hard. You better run.
Hey there, runners, and welcome to this virtual running clinic brought to you by Polar. We're here to provide you with the very best running advice from world-leading experts to help you get the most out of every run, to enjoy it, and to beat your best. This series will bring you a ton of insights and practical advice. Here at Polar, we've been around for over 40 years. You might know us for our heart rate monitors, and we also bring to market a full range of world-class running, fitness, multi-sport, and outdoor watches. We fell in love with running a long time ago, and we want to help you do the same. We are also so proud to be supporting our partners like the Gold Coast Marathon again in 2022, Into Adventure for our off-roaders, and of course our newest partner, Parkrun. So welcome everyone who's joined us from those communities. We've got some great content in store for you today. Today's topic is super important. No matter what your level, pacing yourself and pacing your training is critical to performance and well-being. We know that half of all runners suffer from an injury each year. 92% of new athletes have an increased risk of injury, and 80% of people cite injuries and physical constraints as the main reason why they quit running. We're here today with some good news. It doesn't have to be that way. So stay tuned to find out that critical information on how to best train and recover so that you can continue your fitness journey for the long term. Now let me introduce you to the rest of the Polar team. We have Ross Dougal, Channel Manager for Sport, and our resident sports scientist, John Eastdown. They'll be your hosts through the webinar today, so I'll pass across to Ross to introduce our very special guest. In addition to today's content, we are bringing you a one-stop resource hub by way of the Polar Running Club. It's where you will find all our best resources, including running plans, training tips, articles, and when you do sign up, you'll get on-demand access to these virtual running clinics. You'll also be in to win some great giveaways. So if you haven't already, you can register by the link on the screen and you'll get access today.
Thank you, Kylie. Hi, everyone. It's Ross here. As mentioned, we are bringing you the best running advice from experts to help you beat your best. In this series, we are looking into the top recommendations on how to plan your running training, recovery, and fueling. If you'd like to revisit our recording with Benita Willis for some incredibly helpful advice on how to plan your 5, 10, 21, and 42K training programs, then simply jump over to the recording on our YouTube channel. In this session, we're going to take a big step into one of the most underestimated topics for improving running performance, which is recovery. We'll take a look into the key issues that impact your running recovery, get a clear view on why recovery is so important for runners, help you identify the warning signs if you aren't recovering enough, and provide tips on how to minimize injury and how to start thinking about fueling the right way for the right running sessions, and then jump into some of the important science and technology that can help guide you through all of these issues. As always, we will have a live Q&A throughout with our expert, so we can help answer the questions that are most important to your running. So please make sure you get your questions into the chat box. And to help improve our running, we couldn't be happier to have Brad Bear with us, who is an expert running physiotherapist. Brad and his team at Pogo Physio have helped over 40,000 runners get back on their feet. Brad is also the host of the Physical Performance Show podcast and will be helping to guide us expertly through recovery and performance mastery for runners. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Brad. We really appreciate your time and wanted to get up and running by asking you, after seeing tens of thousands of runners through your practice, Pogo Physio, can you provide us with an overview of why this topic, recovery mastery for runners, is so important?
Thanks, Ross. Yeah, I've been a practicing clinician for 15 years, and over that time have, as you allude to, had the great pleasure and privilege of seeing many runners of all different levels, recreational through to elite. And one common theme is that we're only as good as our recovery in terms of the ability for us to adapt to our training, whether that's 2 hours of training a week or at a professional level, 20 hours plus. So it really is the magic elixir in terms of giving us what we all want, which is trying to go faster, further.
And so out of that, Brad, what are the big issues that you're seeing for runners in terms of recovery?
A trap that many runners of all different levels, probably less so at the elite side of things, can fall into, Ross, and there's a growing awareness of this, which is really great, is the lack of intensity control when training. And I'll put my hands up for this, Ross. I have not gotten this right over every year of my 30 years of taking part in running events and triathlon events. But it's hard to not succumb sometimes to wanting to push sessions that should be taken easily harder, right? So we over-index on these runs that should be steady and aerobic, and we end up spending far too much time running in our given weekly training workload at high intensities. And that does bring with it a heightened risk of injury, running-related injury, and it can also bring with it less adaptation to the actual stimulus that we're doing with our training.
Against all of those challenges, Brad, what are you seeing as the biggest issues for runners when it comes to the topic of recovery?
I'd categorize it into a lack of recovery. So if I reflect on my own athletic journey, it's probably something that's close to me, and that is trying to do too much in a day. So working full-time job, often raising children, families, and then trying to fit training around that, burning the oil at both ends. So a lack of recovery. The second category, if you like, would be a lack of adaptation to the training. So the training stimulus doesn't change, or it doesn't lend itself well to the stressors that the athlete's under, which aren't just training load related. So therefore the athlete doesn't improve. They get into this stuck, stale pattern of not necessarily gaining from the training or improving. Lack of results would be another category. So that's really a byproduct of the former two issues, if you like. And then there's this heightened risk of injury. An example of that is we know that running economy, for example, in the science, reduced for up to 3 weeks following a stressful and negative life event. We also know that psychological factors can absolutely heighten injury risk, whether that's academic stress, emotional stress, self-blame, so blaming ourselves for things, anxiety or perfectionism. These psychological burdens can heighten injury risk as well.
The research that we're seeing coming through is that across all the running distances and the people who are taking part of those, that 50% of runners are injured annually. 92% of new runners or people coming into the category are prone to injury, and 80% of people cite injuries and physical constraints as the main reason that they're quitting running, which are really big numbers, but really shocking given that, I guess, for the most part, a lot of this is actually what you would term sort of a training error or self-inflicted as well, which is really not a great experience for people, especially when they're trying to sign up for a race and actually do something really well. Are there some really key reasons as to why this continues to be such a huge issue right across the running landscape?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Any running-related injury, Ross, has multifactorial causation. So there's always a few things that can contribute. You cited one, training load errors. It's been cited that 60% of all running-related injuries are training load error-based. But alongside that, there can also be fueling deficit, so not getting enough calories in to support the weekly training load. There can be biomechanical considerations. There can be surface interaction considerations. So there's many factors at play in terms of determining injury onset. And I think that's partially why over the years, as you cited, the statistics are still, despite our fancy shoes, despite our good monitoring technologies, it's an ever ongoing war in the sense that runners face, and that is trying to avoid injury. But certainly, like we touched on at the start there, Ross, one of the easy levers to pull or control is not running too hard too often. There is light at the end of the tunnel and we can all learn and get better. I heard today, we either win or we learn, right? So most of the time we're learning and occasionally winning, whatever that looks like for each of us.
There's some really huge implications for the performance of running. And I think it's so important to look at this because people are trying to do better. We're trying to improve running or get into running to start with. And we're putting a lot of time into it. But when it's going wrong for so many people, there's really some important things that have to be addressed. Could you just talk to us a little bit about why then you think that recovery is such an important topic for runners?
It's an important topic, Ross, because it is the thing that drives the training response. So in other words, we train, we recover, we get fitter. And if that recovery interval or how we recover is not optimized, we don't all live in perfect worlds, of course, then the irony is that whatever effort we've put into training may not be realized in full if the recovery is not there. So that's the performance side. And then we've also got obviously the heightened injury risk side. No one wants to be injured. And if the recovery is not optimized, then there's a heightened risk of being sidelined due to a running related injury.
And following on from that, Brad, a really challenging part of running is being really driven to do your training and you want to do your best and not just getting the result that you're after. But can you explain and help us unpack how runners spot if they're in the really dangerous grey zone between being under-recovered or overtrained and what they can actually do about that?
There's been some ongoing debate about whether athletes can be under-recovered or overtrained. And it seems to be becoming clear that rarely does an athlete ever really get into an overtrained state. I recall recovery scientist Shona Halson, who once pointed out that in all her years at the Australian Institute of Sport, she saw perhaps only a handful of athletes that even at an elite level that were truly overtrained. All the others were simply under-recovered. So how do athletes spot whether they're overtraining or under-recovering? Well, made clear that they're probably not overtraining. So how do they spot if they're under-recovering? We look for secondary indicators. So these can be things like loss of libido, just general mood and apathy. If you're being coached by someone in person, they can often see the hair in the cereal test, which is, the athlete just looks apathetic and they're not their usual selves. Perhaps they're a little bit snappier. Their mood's a little bit more volatile. And then we look at physiological signs, such as for a female athlete, change or irregularity in the menstrual cycle. And from a male athlete perspective, there can be changes in morning erectile function, which ties in with generally a reduced level of sex hormone or testosterone.
It's a bit difficult to generalize because everybody's circumstances are so individual, but having a bit more awareness around what your mood is like and how you're being perceived is really important, as we're certainly hearing from you. But if someone is feeling a bit cranky, a bit too short, what's the next course of action from there? Is it, well, look, I've got to pull back on the training. Do I need to throw in a recovery day? And that's really difficult when you're trying to drive towards an event and you've got a structured program. I think it can be very, very easy to then fall into that, I'm going to squeeze an extra session in here and I'll try and get a little bit more sleep, and you start playing jigsaw with that against all the challenges you go in life. So it's quite hard. What would you recommend in terms of some advice in that area to try and cut through the mood and get back on balance?
It's a great question. It's a big question. It's going to be contextualized to everyone's individual circumstances. But I think a general sound piece of advice would be reduce the training workload. And how does an athlete do that? Well, of course, there's 100 ways that can be done. That can be reduce some intensity out of some sessions, drop a session, reduce the length of a session, but somehow find a way to reduce the workload. And I think if someone is feeling a little bit flat, like we just spoke about, or any of those mood indicators, any of those other physiological signs that we mentioned earlier there, Ross, if they're occurring, then be fair to yourself and don't just change things by an hour a week. Give it a good pullback. Drop a chunk out of that training workload. Let your body see if it can spark back up, for want of a better term. And remember what leading sports scientist Shona Halson says, and that is that the only training we're benefiting from is the training we're recovering from. So it's okay if you're tired and you do not feel like going running that morning. Perhaps you're better to stay in bed. Now, there's times when you've got to push yourself, but we're well past a society that snooze and lose. It's now sort of been shifted towards sleep in and win, which is a nice shift.
And that might be a really nice pathway for it if the mood is just one of these really important but sometimes secret indicators. Give some time to let that mood recuperate. It may just be a little bit of sleep. It may be a stressful situation. And it may even mean that, look, get some rest now and later in the day. You might certainly have bounced back, or, grab a good sleep tonight. Don't push that session too late. If you've been pushing it all day and then tomorrow morning, you might feel like you can actually put back into that session and kick on from there.
Yeah, just good for people just to give themselves permission to be a bit kinder to themselves. Sometimes I think we're not very flexible with listening to how we're feeling and we just push on through, and I don't think it's always smart.
Brad, could you help give us some awareness around what are some of the major stress zones for picking up an injury and running, and the role that recovery has in trying to avoid these?
The chief categories of running-related injuries are really bone injuries, so bone stress injuries, soft tissue injuries, such as tendon-related pain or tendinopathies, strains to muscles, and then you've got joint-related pain. And how recovery affects the injury risk of the given runner is fairly obvious when we consider it from a tissue level. So if we take the first example there of a bone stress injury, if said runner is not building in periods of downtime for their skeleton to catch up, the loads from running inside our skeleton can be really high, up to, for example, 14 times our body weight in the shin bone, the tibia. Then the accumulation of micro damage, which occurs with running in our bones, which isn't a bad thing, that normally gets remodeled and never progresses. But if an athlete isn't recovered enough, for all those reasons we've mentioned before, too much too soon, not enough downtime between running sessions, all those reasons, then a given bone in a runner's body can head towards a stress reaction or stress fracture. A good example is a well-reputed runner in Australia who just ran the Australian national 10,000 metres. Last year, his Olympic Games marathon in Tokyo didn't go to plan. He developed a bone stress injury. It's in the public domain before that event, and the marathon didn't get completed as a result. Fast forward to 2022, and that runner has just set our national record, and he's now taken a day off a week from his training, whereas he used to run twice a day, every day. So not only has he reduced his bone stress injury risk, he's also just gone through the roof with the best 10,000 metre run any Australian has ever done. So that's a good little practical real life example.
Are there some other key areas of injuries that you would see commonly from runners? And I think it's probably important to note that at the moment, we've got a lot of people who are embarking on the start of their main parts for their training programs, or they've now just gone, you know what, I need to kick the training program off now. So people are getting pretty excited. So it's probably quite a dangerous time in terms of picking up an injury. Are there certain injuries that you would see more commonly across people at this time, and some things that people could look out for?
The clock ticks with the countdown now leading into the marathon weekend, whether that's in one of the junior runs or the 10K, half marathon or full marathon. And we can all succumb to the internal pressure that we put on ourselves to be as ready as we can for these events. But we can't cram the training if we're running short on weeks. So we're better to get to the start line than not get to the start line, because all of a sudden we get nervous that we're running out of weeks and we start to cram. So the common injuries that we may see people succumb to are shin pain or medial tibial stress syndrome or bone stress of the shin bone. It's really common in beginner runners who can go from zero to hero quite quickly. And if we're all honest, we've probably all been there at stages. So to the beginner runner, just really ensure you're putting as much gap between your running bouts each week as you can, and initially keep the intensity out of there, because faster running really does heighten the workload of the bones. Then we also see, Ross, often some Achilles tendon issues. I think most runners would have experienced this at some point. And the tendons are really sensitive to change. A really well-reputed tendon researcher, clinician, Ebony Rio, she often says, you've got to sneak up on tendons. They don't like sudden surprises. So keep that in mind. If we're changing a program or increasing our workload, try and do it gradually to not annoy a tendon, such as an Achilles tendon. And plantar fasciitis, Ross, is a big one as well, in the bottom of the foot, if you like. Getting out of bed feels a bit yuck, like you're walking on eggshells. It's a little bit like Achilles tendon issues, in that if we have sudden changes, that can often predispose us to making that sore as well. So really, in summary, make sure we aren't going too fast too often, and don't make big sudden wholesale changes, whether that's the number of miles you run a week or kilometers, or the intensity of those miles, or the terrain. Don't start doing every run up big hills and down big hills.
In our last session, when we looked at how to build a training plan with Benita Willis, we obviously saw there were different types of runs that we should have if we're going to have an effective training plan. So we had easy runs, we had long runs, tempo, intervals, and the like. If that's the case, obviously there are going to be different requirements on the body. Could you take us through how you would start to spot if we're not actually fueling ourselves enough for those sessions, and obviously to take in the demands of daily life and stress and everything else that we're absorbing?
It's an important topic about fueling for our athletic endeavors. The good news is there are some indicators that people can take note of. The bad news is that it's not always very practical or feasible to get it exactly right. So to answer the question, Ross, there's this adage which has trickled down from Team Sky, Tour de France, all-conquering cycling team, and their nutritionist, and that is fuel for the workload required. So if there's a high training week, you need to increase your caloric intake. Otherwise, we run the risk of being in that energy deficit, which harms performance and can ultimately impact on health. Once again, there's these secondary indicators, like we mentioned, about being aware of our recovery status. So if a male athlete or runner is not achieving 5 morning erections a week, there's a fair chance they're underfueled or under-recovered. And it's a funny one. The blokes will have a laugh, but it gets cut through. For female athletes, if there's a change or absence in menstrual cycle for greater than 3 months, that is a clear sign that an athlete, excluding medical conditions, pregnancy, oral contraceptive pill use, of course, that is a clear sign that that female athlete or runner is not fueled enough. And then you've got performance indicators. So if performance is just sluggish and not improving, that athlete could be underfueled. And then you can look at things like the blood tests and look at the sex hormone profile for the male and female runner and see if they're in the normal or not normal range. At the elite level and recreationally elite, sub-elite level, it's not implausible to sometimes see young, by perception, very fit people with sex hormone levels that are parallel to 60, 70 plus year old people because they are underfueled and not taking recovery seriously enough or just unaware of what they need to be doing to change it around.
Brad, there are obviously many different ways that we can manage the running effort. So we've got time, we've got perceived effort, we've got heart rate zones, we've got speed zones, and for some we've also got running power. But one of the things that we've been hearing about the most is running pace. Can you tell us why it's so critical to manage pace for runners?
Pace is the holy grail, if you like, of injury risk for a runner. And that's because, as we touched on earlier, Ross, an increase in, take bone for an example, our skeletons, an increase in running speed increases the magnitude of the bone loading. And bones can handle an increase in the number of loading cycles quite well. So if you go from 20 kilometers of running a week to 40 kilometers a week, your relative risk of incurring a bone stress injury has doubled as your workload has doubled. If you increase your pace, which you run those miles at, then it exponentially increases the risk of a bone stress injury. So one of the scientific findings that I like to educate runners around is that a 10% increase in pace can confer a 50% reduction in our skeleton's fatigue threshold before it becomes stressed. So a 10% increase in pace is not much, yet it halves that bone fatigability threshold. So I cannot overstress enough. Please be very mindful of when you do your intensity running and how you do it. And I'm pointing my fingers at myself because I'm still trying to do better in this space. Let's make sure we're not getting carried away when our run should be easy. It's because of that very risk of this one thing, bone stress alone.
Brad, thank you so much for everything that you've shared so far. From the tens of thousands of runners that you've treated, and I realize it's hard to unpack everything as we're all so different, but if you could pass across your very top tips for recovery for runners, what would they be?
Firstly, Ross, they're not my words, but it's powerful, and that is fuel for the work required. If your training workload goes up, your fueling needs to go up to match it. Secondly, be intensity controlled. So take note of the intensity that you're doing your sessions at. If it's meant to be a hard session or fast session, make it a fast session. If it's meant to be a steady run, please make it a steady run. And the third top tip, if you like, Ross, would be to be kind to yourself. I'm as guilty as the next person of expecting a record every week when we train. And it's just not practical. It's not reality. It's not doable. It's not sustainable. So if you're feeling tired, you don't feel like you want to get up out of bed and go for that session, perhaps it's best that you don't. So give yourself permission to be kind to yourself and take note of those mood signals like we discussed, and see if you can look at the long-term view of your training rather than the short-term seasonal results. See if you can not be injured for a year and watch yourself flourish. In the science, Ross, in the literature, it's been well documented that sleep affects injury risk. Obviously, it affects our overall health. Obviously, there's a great awareness around the importance of sleep, and we're dropping some of the trophies that we used to have for, hey, I'm not sleeping many hours and look how productive I am, which is a great societal shift. But a paper that's quite well reported and often cited is Molesky 2014 and co, who looked at the effect of sleep deprivation on heightened injury risk for 160 high school athletes in grades 7 to 12. And what they found was that of those 160 high school athletes, those who slept less than 8 hours a night had a 170% greater likelihood of injury than those that slept 8 hours or more. Now, we all know that 8 hours is utopian, but the takeaway is more sleep is better in reducing injury risk, let alone well-being markers and everything else. So how do we get more sleep? It's certainly not easy. We're all juggling typically lots of pressures in our daily lives and weeks. I think just awareness is the top tip there, Ross, just to be aware that do the best that you can to try and optimize your sleep duration and quality. And I think most people are pretty aware of some of the little hacks and tricks that we hear all the time now about phones out of the bedroom, etc. A big one, though, that I often recall is that about pets. Pets on the bed, they've shown that that really does reduce the quality of sleep quite a lot. So it's not easy. I like to give my little Spoodle a cuddle when she comes under the bed in the morning, but, if we can, be aware of the pets.
Thank you so much, Brad. What I'd like to do now is to pass across to John, our resident sports scientist, and start to have a look at how we can use some of the technology really easily to take us into some of the science around recovery to help show us exactly where we're at and how to steer away from injury.
Thanks, guys. Hi, everyone. John here from the Polar team. Thanks for having me again. What I'd like to do in this next section is just highlight how technology can assist us in doing some of the things that Brad's spoken about today, mainly controlling the intensity of our efforts, recovering correctly from our training bouts, and managing our training load in order to minimize our risk of injuries. So bear with me if you would here, guys. I'll try not to get too sciencey, but to the first point, we know that there is a clear linear relationship between heart rate and exercise intensity. In other words, as exercise intensity increases, in our case, running pace increases, so too does heart rate in a linear fashion. So that means we can use heart rate as a gauge of the exercise intensity. And this is where a Polar Watch can be very helpful because we can see heart rate live during a training session, and therefore we have a way of managing the intensity of the session. An example might be during a low intensity run where the aim is to keep the heart rate in zone 2. Or we may need to reduce our running speed to keep the heart rate in the correct zone and therefore keep the intensity of the session on the lower side of things. But we can think of the training session as the stimulus that we apply to the body, and we then adapt to that stimulus during the recovery period. And a common question we receive is, well, how do I know that I'm recovering well from my training? Brad's already spoken of how we can gauge this, and one way is with subjective measurements, and that's we ask ourselves, how motivated am I for training today? How's my mood? How irritable am I? And if these things are down, it could be a sign that we're not quite adequately recovered from previous training sessions. But we can complement these measurements with objective measurements, and two very effective ways of doing this is with resting heart rate measurements on a daily basis that I'm sure you've heard of. We've also got heart rate variability, which is even more sensitive in giving us information on how well our bodies are recovering from training. And again, this is where technology and a Polar Watch can help because these things are measured automatically during your sleep, and you would receive feedback on a daily basis on how well your recovery is going, and even feedback on what kind of intensity of training session would be suitable for that day. Brad's also spoken of the importance of training load and how errors in training load, or in other words, large spikes in training load on a week-to-week basis, can put us at increased risk for injuries such as soft tissue injury or bone stress injuries. And managing the training load begins with measuring the training load, and that's done automatically with a Polar Watch. There's also an extremely valuable feature where you receive feedback on whether your training load is too little, too much, or just right. So now I'd like to just give a few examples of how we can use a Polar Watch to assist us to do some of the things that Brad's spoken of. And the first one would be intensity control of our training sessions. We can see an example on this slide of a poor example of intensity control where a low intensity run has in fact become higher intensity than desired. This could possibly increase our injury risk. It's easy to manage intensity with a Polar Watch by the zone lock feature where you receive sound alerts when the intensity is becoming too high. And then we have our objective way of measuring our body's recovery. And that's the nightly recharge feature, definitely a favourite of the Polar team and Polar users. And this is an automatic measurement of sleep quality, but also resting heart rate and heart rate variability. And that gives us valuable information on when we might not be quite recovered from training and we should take an easy session or a low intensity session, or when we're actually ready to take on the world and conduct one of our higher intensity sessions. And finally, training load management. And we can view our training load in a number of ways, such as total training time or total distance covered, just as two examples. The Polar Watch then tracks these daily and weekly changes in training load and gives us feedback on when we're doing too little or detraining, when we're doing the same load or maintaining our fitness, when we're doing just a little bit more than previous and being productive, or whether we're doing too much more than previous and actually placing ourselves at an increased risk of injury. So I hope some of this information has shown you how technology can assist us in improving the training process and ultimately reaching our training goals. If you do have any questions on any of this information, please do be in touch, and I'll pass back over to Ross. Cheers, guys.
Thank you so much for that, John. If anyone has any questions on running technology or the science behind it all, do drop your questions into the comment section for John. If you haven't joined the Polar Running Club yet, you can via the link on the screen. Here, you'll get early access to our webinar recordings, go in the draw to win a new running watch, and get access to our best running resources as we continue to help support the running community. We'd love to see you there. It's free to join via the link or just search for Polar Running Club. If you have been getting into your training and starting to feel some of the injury or training load warning signs we've spoken about today, and you're worried about an existing or new running injury, do reach out to Brad and his expert team of physiotherapists and healthcare professionals, even if it's for a virtual consult. They can be found at pogophysio.com or via the link on screen, and we certainly couldn't recommend anyone better to help get you back to your physical running best. Brad Bear also has an incredible opportunity for those who are looking to learn more about endurance training. On Saturday, the 2nd of April, Brad will be hosting Dr. Stephen Seiler in a live stream event. Dr. Seiler is one of the world's leading experts on endurance training for runners, and they'll be taking a deep dive into unpacking long-term training strategy, how to get the balance right between your training zones, how to execute high-intensity training for endurance athletes, as well as the latest insights in training monitoring. If you'd like to get the edge for your endurance training, you can reserve a spot on the live stream for only $49, link on screen. This is a very rare session to get access to, and you'll have Dr. Stephen Seiler in audience for 3 hours, as well as receive the PDF presentation and recorded copy of their endurance training insights. As we've heard from a lot of our experts in this running series around planning your runs and recovery, nutrition is absolutely key. Next up, on the 13th of April, we're very lucky to have Danielle DeFrancesco with us. Danielle is a registered practicing specialist in sports nutrition. Not only is she an elite athlete herself, she is also sponsored by Fix, who will be providing the on-course nutrition for this year's Gold Coast Marathon Series. If you want to get the expert's advice on how to fuel well for your training sessions so you can perform at your best, but also train with nutrition and confidence and have the right nutrition strategy for your big running day, then this is a fantastic session to tune into. And we look forward to having you and all your questions then. We're now going to jump across to live Q&A. So please make sure you drop your injury or recovery questions in the comments so we can get you direct help from our expert, Brad Bear. For some fantastic questions which have been coming through, everybody. Brad, we might make a start through the questions and the feedback that people have put through. Having looked through the questions here, we're getting a fair bit around calf injury and also soreness. And there was a really interesting question which came through from Tien, who halfway through half marathon training has started to get some calf tightness recently. That's popped up on long run, and that's been diagnosed as soleus strain. Taken several days off and started to load vertically and horizontally, but now feeling a little bit nervous about getting back into action and potentially aggravating that injury. And that's a really good question around what to do and how to ease back into the running after getting through that amount of training and not actually making it worse. Any recommendations?
Yeah, it's a great question. Sorry to hear of the concern. Calf strains are one of the most common running-related injuries, certainly in masters athletes, 35-plus athlete. You rarely find a masters athlete that at some point hasn't incurred a calf strain. As you mentioned, Ross, there's soleus strain, so that's the deep muscle of our calf musculature. It's actually the strongest working muscle of our running kinetic chain. So it works up to around 8 times our body weight, peak force, every single stride, whether we're running fast or slow. So there's a propensity for the soleus to get injured, and when it does present differently to the muscle that sits on top, the gastroc, and it does need some nuancing around how that they're best rehabilitated. So, for example, when returning to running with a return to run program after incurring a soleus strain, we want to try and avoid cumulative fatigue to the soleus. So instead of saying go out and just trot around for 20, 25 minutes, we might give someone 10, 100 run-throughs with walkbacks to avoid that cumulative fatigue. And the other, I guess, tip there would be so making sure the return to running program's done well, but also making sure there's sufficient strength in that strained muscle. And the best way to get that done is seated calf raises. And as I mentioned, the force that muscle produces is enormous. So the strength and conditioning efforts need to be really heavy. So we talk about 1 to 1.5 times your body weight, single leg seated calf raises. So they'd be my big 2 tips: strengthen it and make sure the return to running program's appropriate.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brad. We've got a couple of questions here around something that Paul's termed self-panel beating or foam rolling, and what he's doing at the moment is foam rolling 1 to 2 times a day, not for long periods. But is that something that people need to be wary of in terms of not overdoing or reducing? And we've got a couple of questions around sports massage as well there. So, making sure that activity is actually not aggravating the muscles, but also so that it's actually providing the right amount of recovery. How can people try and get some guidelines there?
Yeah, foam rolling, it's a popular practice. And the key thing is it's rarely going to do anyone harm. There's only a few times where it may, and that's a common running-related injury. The IT band, which wraps up the side of the leg, can often aggravate people at the level of the knee, laterally on the outside. And sometimes the people's first response to that is getting on a roller and really trying to push through it and work through the pain. And that's a rare example where that can actually often aggravate that condition. But aside from aggravating IT band pain by rolling up and down the outside of the leg too vigorously when someone's symptomatic with that injury, people can't generally harm themselves too much by foam rolling. There's no scientific literature to say that there's a correct amount of time to do that for. And I generally go with the view that as long as a runner's getting time for some strength work, if they then want to layer on top some foam rolling, it ticks boxes. Psychologically, it feels like there's some recovery being done, and we know it's not going to generally do anyone harm. So I'm all for it. It's a safe way to do some recovery exercise, if you like. But like so many things, the science isn't there to yet support it, but that might change with time.
Great, thank you, Brad. Also, just finishing off with Paul, and Prez also had a question on this, which is around assuming that the training is progressing well and the body's in good shape, should you still plan to deload on certain weeks? So often what we see is some people might have 2 or 3 weeks worth of progression, then that fourth week is an easier period. There's obviously a number of ways to do that, but would you be looking to certainly to have some deload weeks or specific recovery periods within the training program for adaptation?
Yeah, it's a it's $1 million question, because if this is the holy grail, and honestly, Polar's load monitoring technologies are amazing for this, as John outlined there before. I'm supporting my my Polar Vantage V2 Shift, and it's a great low fuss way to give people a bit of an idea around their training loads and their recovery status. So yeah, absolutely, everyone needs some period of training in their, say, 52-week year where they're absorbing the work that's been done. There's nuanced ways to do that. So, looking at heart rate variability and looking at when the heart rate variability goes down. So, i.e., the body's probably under a bit of stress. Noting that we need that to challenge the system. But if there's signs like John mentioned, and I mentioned as well, mood's down, they're feeling a bit irritable, they're just not motivated to train, then that could be correlated with life stressors, like we touched on, relational, financial, all the different stresses that people deal with. And they can be great windows of time to say, right, just going to be kind to myself. I'm not going to expect a lot of myself. Family member's sick or whatever it is. And so you can approach it like that on an as-need basis based on your data, or you could, for example, Ross, it's common practice, do 3 weeks on, 1 week off. But the answer directly to the question is yes, everyone needs some window of time where they're giving themselves permission to be doing a smaller workload, trying to absorb the work that's gone before.
Great, thank you, Brad. Look, Emma's putting her hand up here, certainly for some advice. Unfortunately, she's had ongoing hamstring ache for 12 months. So she's tried physio, anti-inflammatories, not getting better, has cut back the running volume as well to 3 times a week, but the ongoing hammy aches are still there and really starting to feel really debilitated around that. Any advice for Em?
Yeah, certainly. Depends where it is, if it's up high or down low. I suspect it might be up high, as in on the sitting bone, because that's a common running related injury, proximal hamstring tendon concerns, and it's a pesky condition. It can hang around for a long time, but it's a matter of trying to do 2 things: manage the workload whilst concurrently trying to increase the tissue capacity. Managing the workload, for example, can look like if it's quite irritable, i.e. it's more than a 5 out of 10 with soreness after running, or you run and then you sit down and it's really sore, then you want to pull back in your overall workload. Now, overall workload reductions can look like less mileage, can look like less intensity, and intensity is the greater evil of the 2. Speed, efforts, intensity running with sore tendons, they do not go well. So really strip the intensity out, reduce the volume, and try and get the symptoms down to a 1 or 2 out of 10. If after running 24 hours later with a sore proximal hamstring tendon, it's more than a 5 out of 10, that's suggesting that prior run was too much. So you want to try and get those symptoms down. And then alongside that, it's about increasing the tissue health. So when we talk about that hamstring injury, we're talking about increasing the hamstring musculature, the strength and abilities there, prone hamstring curls. There's a few key exercises, and also making sure everything else is strengthened around that: the calves, the hip abductors, the hip muscles, the quads, etc. So 2-pronged approach. They run in tandem. And the third thing there is to appreciate these can really take some time and be testing.
Thank you for that, Brad. And I hope certainly, Emma, that gives you a few pointers to work with there. Brad, one of our first questions that came in was from Josh. So he's getting a severe and instantaneous pain on the right side of his knee, lower outside position after running for more than 5K. He has had 0 pain, but then starts to feel a weird sensation and the knee almost locks up. The pain goes away and mobility returns after hobbling and walking for about 10 minutes, at which point he can run again, although it only lasts for another 2K and then straight back in. The same pain or sensation continues. However, when on a bike, absolutely 0 symptoms whatsoever. Any thoughts on that for Josh?
Yeah, Josh, obviously, without a physical examination or assessment or more history, it can be difficult. But with that working information, you'd have to be strongly suspicious of what we mentioned before, the IT band. So iliotibial band pain. Many people still refer to it as IT band, as IT band syndrome or friction syndrome. That terminology has been dropped because it tends to suggest it gets sore rubbing back and forwards when it actually gets sore by being compressed. So most likely, Josh, IT band pain is your diagnosis. It's on that outside aspect of the knee, and it can feel sharp, like someone sticking a knife in your knee. I've had it, and that's often what runners say. They feel like they've broken a bone. So similar to my prior response about the hamstring, there's two things, Josh, to think about. Pulling back the workload to see if you can find a happy workload that isn't provocative. Sometimes that can be achieved. You might cut your workload in half and keep running, or if it's really, really pesky and irritable, you might need to stop for a week or two, but we want you to get going as soon as we can so you don't decondition too much. And alongside that, it's all about strength and conditioning. I'll sound like a broken record here, but getting the hip muscles really strong to stop what's likely happening, which is a drop of your knee into the midline when you run. Getting those muscles strong, getting the calf muscles strong, basically getting everything strong and returning to running that way. And it will take time, sometimes longer, other times not as long, but I've never met a runner that can't get on top of IT band pain, but get some good help, Josh, and get out there as soon as you can.
Thank you very much for that, Brad. We've had certainly some questions around weight training, and it may be easier to kind of look at some of the more broader guidelines and the really key specific areas that runners should be including in their week, which we've certainly spoken quite a bit about. The direct question we had from Michael was, with weight training, should I be doing lots of reps with medium weights or a few reps with heavy weights? There's certainly some other guidelines around strength there for runners as well.
Yeah, it's a great topic to discuss, and it's an important one, strength and conditioning for runners. The benefits are enormous, improving running economy, time trial performance, maximal sprint speed. And whilst we don't or haven't yet been able to conclusively link strength and conditioning programs to a reduction in running-related injuries, doesn't mean that link doesn't exist. This hasn't been shown in the science yet. And as I'm sharing, every rehabilitation effort for a running-related injury comes back to strength and conditioning. So to answer the question, as runners, we already do high repetitions. If we go out and run for an hour, we're doing 5,400 reps or foot strikes on each side in general terms. So that's 5,400 muscle contractions. So we're doing high reps. So when we're in the gym, we're trying to increase our tissue capacities or abilities. There's three factors to consider: our endurance, our peak force production, and our plyometric properties. So when we go to the gym, we best develop those properties through working towards heavier loads or resistances over time. For example, we might end up at 5x5 reps or 4x8 reps, but we definitely don't want to be looking at typically 3x50 reps. Otherwise, we might as well go for a run, as Rich Willey, a quite well-known, very well-known, I should say, running researcher says. So when we're in the gym, we're trying to push heavy weights, isolate the muscle groups, do some compound exercises as well. We're there to get the tissue strength up, and we won't do that with high reps. We can work on endurance with high reps, which sometimes is needed, but typically it's about getting that peak force ability up, and that's through higher weights, lower reps.
You talked a little bit about massage before. Brad, also just a question here from Kate around what are your thoughts on massage guns for recovery?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kate. Actually just wrote an article on this by request for Triathlon 220 magazine in the UK. So I was working through the literature. There's some emerging literature, which is nice to note, that it can be effective in reducing DOMs and improving recovery. That's the science side of it. It's an emerging area. Obviously, it's only quite new technology. But then anecdotally, you'll ask or talk to athletes who think it's a big part of their recovery strategy. So my thoughts are it's certainly not going to hurt. There's no downside. If someone's got one and they've got the time to use it, then and they feel like it's helping, then wonderful. Science is still coming through, but that's not unlike a lot of things like we've already discussed tonight.
We've got to the end of our live Q&A session. So look, I'd like to thank everybody for turning up tonight and for putting a great interest in their training. And also a big thank you to Brad. We wish you very well with your training and hope you do that safely. And just like to pass across to Brad for a thank you and a goodbye. And we'll head on out. Thank you so much for turning up, everybody.
Ross and John and everyone attending, all the best with your running. Leading into the Gold Coast Marathon weekend. It's one of the best weekends going around. If you didn't get a question answered tonight and you're able to reach out to the organisers, Ross and John, I'm more than happy to make time to answer every question that didn't get answered. So I'm not sure, Ross, if there's that capability, but if there's not via the Polar stream, people can find me on social and I'm more than happy to help with questions being answered.
And for anyone who's really looking to dial in their nutrition, so really importantly for training and also for race day, in 2 weeks' time, we'll have Danielle DiFrancesco, who is a nutrition specialist and also elite athlete. So she'll be very well equipped to help us out on that session. We've certainly had a few nutrition questions tonight. So we look forward to seeing you on the next session. But until then, happy running and look after yourself. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.